supposed to wait for this red light to come on, right? Good evening, everyone. It is now 6:30, and I will call to order this regular meeting of the Keene Zoning Board of Adjustment. This meeting is being broadcast live on the City of Keene YouTube channel and the city website. The video is also posted on the city website by the end of the next business day, barring any technical difficulties. Anyone wishing to view a copy of the agenda and supporting materials will find it on the city website. To receive electronic copies of future agenda packets, please go to the homepage and subscribe to the city meetings email list. The public and other board members will be recognized to ask questions and make comments on each agenda item under discussion. After being recognized, please make all remarks through the chair. Anyone who wishes to address the board is asked to go to one of the microphones in the room, identify yourselves by name and address prior to speaking. As a reminder, the minute taker is participating remotely this evening. Board members, please be sure to turn on your microphone when speaking. If the minute taker is unable to hear, they will ask that you speak louder or turn your microphone on. So, with that said, we'll turn to the agenda. My name is Joe Hoppick, I'm the chair, and to my left,
Jane Taylor?
Josh Foreman.
Richard Clough, Michael Welsh.
thank you, everybody. We have two sets of minutes to review tonight on the agenda, November 7th and April 3rd. I've gone over the November 7th minutes, and I'm lost as to what all the blanks should be filled in with, so I will be of no use in that regard. Anybody else?
I believe I was not here November 7th.
That takes Mike out of it. Oh, Ms. Taylor?
Yeah, I was not here November 7th either, so I can't tell you what happened. I don't know, we've had this same speech at the beginning of the last several meetings, and I just wonder, even though I can't vote on it, whether or not you might just want to adopt them as is if we can't fill in any of the blanks.
Is that the case for the two of you as well?
I don't have any blank filling to do, but I am willing to adopt the minutes as is. I'm comfortable in reviewing them, that they're adequate.
All right, I'll take that as a motion and second.
Indeed.
Okay. With respect to the November 7th minutes, all those in favor, please raise your hand. And the two of you are not voting because you weren't there. Gotcha, okay. With respect to April 3rd, any comments on those minutes? Attorney Taylor?
Yeah, I just have one comment on line 588, which is page 17 of 135. It starts off, it says 73 paid parking spaces. I think the paid should be removed because they're basically not charging for any of the parking spaces.
What
This
line
is,
did you say that was?
588.
Okay.
This was for the Court Street change of use application, or I guess it was a special exception. So it just doesn't seem to make sense to have that word in there.
So you want to strike the word paid?
Yes.
Okay. No objections? Any other comments? Josh?
I will be abstaining from this vote because I was not here on the 3rd of April.
Okay.
Move to accept with the changes recommended.
I second. All those in favor? It carries, and Josh is abstaining.
Mr. Chair, if we could just, for clarity for the minute taker, make mention of who voted in the affirmative for the November meeting minutes, just for the minute taker, please.
So all voted in favor except for Mr. Walsh and Ms. Taylor, who abstained due to absence.
Thank you so much.
And on this last vote, all voted in favor except for Mr. Gorman, who abstained due to absence. All right. Takes care of the minutes. Mr. Rogers, I don't see anything under unfinished business, but there is that issue of the 2-2 vote. I'm wondering if you want to take that up.
If you like, Mr. Chair, yes, we actually have received an email from the applicant asking for that application to be withdrawn without prejudice.
Okay, so that's for the record, ZBA 2309.
Correct, that was for the ADU on Page Street.
Okay, that's on the third item on the agenda tonight, so we'll just skip ahead of that and note that that is withdrawn without prejudice. Is everybody in agreement with that? All right,
And you're correct, Mr. Chair, there is no other unfinished business at this time.
not now. Okay, great. So, Mr. Fippard, we'll take up ZBA 2303. Petitioner Sampson Associates LLC, represented by Jim Fippard of Brickstone Land Use Consultants LLC, requests a variance for property located at 32 Optical Avenue, tax map 113006, 3 sets of triple zeros, and is in the Industrial Park District. The petitioner requests to permit self-storage units on a lot in the Industrial Park District where self-storage units are not listed as a permitted use, per Chapter 100, Article 6.3.5 of the zoning regulations. Mr. Fippard, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am here tonight on behalf of Sampson Associates LLC, and we are requesting for the last time that this application be continued to the June 5th meeting. And to explain, I was contacted through his attorney, Tom Hanna, by the Putnams, requesting that this be delayed to the June meeting. And speaking to my client, he wants to be a good neighbor, he agreed he would postpone this further, trying to accommodate the abutter. So that's why we made this request.
So you have an agreement between the applicant and one of the abutters to put it off to June 5th?
That's correct.
Okay. Having heard that, does anybody want to make a motion to continue it to June 5th? Mr. Gorman?
I would move to continue ZBA 23-03 to June 5th. Are we doing 2304 as well?
Let
have
him speak to that first.
Okay.
Attorney Taylor?
Second.
Motion being made and seconded. All those in favor, please raise your right hand. It is unanimous.
Thank you.
Let me call 2304. I'll read it, and then you can speak to it.
Sure.
Petitioner Sampson Associates LLC and represented by Jim Fippard of Brickstone Land Use Consultants LLC requests a variance for property located at 32 Optical Avenue, tax map 113-06, 3 sets of triple zeros, and is in the Industrial Park District. The petitioner requests to permit a vehicle fueling station on a lot in the Industrial District where vehicle fueling station is not a permitted use, per Chapter 100, Article 6.3.5 of the zoning regulations. Mr. Fippard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's the same explanation. We're requesting to be continued to June 5th at the request of an abutter, and we're trying to accommodate him.
Mr. Gorman.
I'll make a motion to continue ZBA 23-04.
Attorney Taylor.
I'll second that.
Motion being made and duly seconded. All those in favor, raise your right hand. It unanimously carries. That 2304 is continued to next meeting.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll see you next month.
Yes, sir. And we've already addressed 2309, so we'll go right to 2311, if you were prepared to present. Is this yours? You're the this is, yep.
I know Jim likes to stand up, but I don't think as well on my feet as he does, so I will sit.
Attorney Taylor, go ahead. Hold on one second, gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I need to recuse myself on this because I sit on the board of the Monadnock Conservancy and they're in a butter, so I will step down.
All right. Let me just read the application, and then you can proceed. Petitioner Keene Meadows Solar Station LLC of Boston, Massachusetts, represented by A. Eli
Lano.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Of
you.
Bernstein, Shore, Sawyer, and Nelson of Manchester, New Hampshire, requests a variance for property located at 0 Gilsum Road, tax map 214001, 3 sets of triple zeros, is in the rural district and is owned by DLC Spofford LLC of Stuart, Florida. The petitioner requests to request to permit a 30-acre large scale ground-mounted solar energy system where 20 acres is allowed per Chapter 100, Article 8.3.7. C.2. Lower B of the zoning regulations. Go ahead, sir.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman. I believe John might be next.
Yep.
Or
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Introduce,
There's
sure.
a pretty light file on this, but I figure we'll go through it. On 0 Gilsum Road, the parcel located in the rural zone, 178 acres. There's currently no buildings and no ZBA applications on file. They're asking for 30 acres where a max 20 acres allowed in this zone for a solar system.
Mr. Walsh.
I'm familiar with the fact that the Conservation Commission has reviewed this application and spoken to these applicants before. And I'm just wondering if you could describe the purview of the Conservation Commission's review of this application, and if you can, report any decisions that they may have come to.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know there's been some conversation. I do not know if they've actually, the Conservation Commission has come out with any actual deliberation from that commission. I'm not aware, and I don't have it at my fingertips to be able to answer that question.
Mr. Chair, I wouldn't mind addressing that briefly as part of my comments.
Okay, go ahead. But before you get started, does the administration have anything further to add?
Nothing
this
to further
application?
to add at this time, Mr. Chair.
Okay. This
Thank
time
you.
the floor is really yours.
Okay. Again, Eli Lano from Bernstein Sure. I'm joined tonight by Ari Jackson from the applicant, Glenvale Solar, and also Keene Metal Solar, which is a subsidiary. I brought Mr. Jackson tonight to try to describe this project, the company, and basically why this location here in Keene. And I think those are all going to be maybe not a piece of the 5 criteria, but relevant for this board to get a sense of what's happening here. And then with all solar projects classified as large scale, which is the up to 20 acres under your zoning ordinance, there's a conditional use permit through the planning board required. And as part of that, the Conservation Commission gets to make recommendations. Additionally, because we will have DES, depending on wetlands, et cetera, they get copies of any of those applications to the state and have it's not a jurisdictional role, but they are the local contact for that piece. So the state actions go through the local Conservation Commission. And then just as an introduction to our dealings with the Concom, we went maybe 2 months ago at this point for the first.
March 20th.
Yeah, so we were on March 20th under no obligation other than for the fact that we understand that this is something that matters deeply in Keene and also generally to the Conservation Commission, or specifically to the Conservation Commission. We went and had an informational meeting with them to discuss the project, because I think it's important to have a sense of what's going on here and how what goes through the zoning board, why we've submitted a site plan where we've asked for one thing, and you can clearly look at it as members of the ZBA and see that we need a setback variance, et cetera, why we've bifurcated our applications. In large part, we're before you with an area variance to ask for greater than 20 acres for solar, but before we have a ruling from the zoning board, it's really financially unfeasible for us to design this whole project down to the ground scale, knowing where all our vernal pools are, et cetera. We have started with the mapping, have an engineer and a wetland scientist engaged. We are really working to get our ducks in a row correctly, but we're at the point in the application where we have an idea what we want to do. We have a sense of the size. We're going to need to start discussing interconnections with the utilities, et cetera. So at this point in the application, that's why we're before the ZBA for this area variance. But before I get into 5 criteria, et cetera, I just want to introduce Ari Jackson and allow him to speak a little bit about the applicant, about how they pick projects generally, about how they found this site, and about really their desire to work in this municipality.
Thank you, Eli. So I'll give a brief introduction. My name is Ari Jackson. I'm a Senior Director of Development with Glenvale Solar. Glenvale is a leading independent developer of utility-scale solar and energy storage projects in New England. We are a team of 15 individuals with offices in Portland, Maine, and Boston, Massachusetts. And the founding principle of the company is that generating clean, reliable energy doesn't have to come at a premium. And so our goal is to, or we pursue this goal by selecting a small number of compelling projects that bring benefits to the local community as well as have the ability to generate affordable electricity. So we have currently in our portfolio 6 advanced projects. 5 of those are in Maine, and 2 we would expect to enter construction later this year and early into next year. Keene Meadow Solar Station would be our first New Hampshire project, and as it's currently designed, includes 50 megawatts of solar generation and 50 megawatts of battery electric storage. This is, in its first year of operation, it would generate enough energy to power approximately 14,000 New Hampshire homes, as well as offset the CO2 equivalent of approximately 88,000 acres of mature forest. It is located, as you're aware, at the intersection of 2 transmission corridors between Old Gilsum Road and Route 10. We believe it's a very compelling project. We have an extensive process by which we review sites to select them to pursue, and so that includes a review of natural resources, upland soils, the viability of interconnection, et cetera. And this is a project that very much meets the criteria for this type of development. And we also believe it would bring a lot of benefits to the city of Keene, as well as play an important role in the state's transition to renewable energy. We also understand that it needs a variance, and that's the reason we're here today. So I'll allow Eli to talk through the details of our application, unless there are any other further questions.
Thank you, Ari. And then before I get into the 5 criteria, I again, just think it's important to think about what the town's ordinance or city's ordinance has. It seems to me that the 20 acres was a number in our preliminary design meetings with Mr. Rogers and some of the other staff. It seems like that was a number that was picked because it seems like a nice big number. It's not too big, but it seemed like it's a good round number that would work. On this site, it's a bit too small to be a logical use, whereas if you had a 25-acre lot in the middle of town, you could put up a 25 or 20-acre solar project. You're gonna have to clear any buffer really, because these need to have clear access to the sun to work for obvious reasons. So 20 acres sounds big, but if you were to start putting those in the city, in downtown, it's a little unfeasible. There's not that many parcels like this. So in part of finding this site, it's a spot where it really makes sense because you have a neighborhood where you have 2 transmission lines already, which obviously helps with infrastructure connections. You also have 2 reasonably large roadways. And I was driving down the hill from Nelson and that direction and looking to see what you can see driving on Route 9 back into the city. And you really get the front row of trees, and then there is an elevation change, but you really don't see too deeply into the site. So by having a large enough parcel, you have the opportunity to retain some mature tree buffer, also have some additional uses. We know that the trees and trails, et cetera, here are important to people. So on a large enough parcel, we can have a highly generating solar facility, while also rerouting some of the nature trails that people like and figuring out ways to make this productive for both the owners and applicant here, but also make it still viable for the city as a recreational use. So without further ado, I think that gets you largely into where we are, who we are, and what we're trying to do. I think it probably makes sense to get into the 5 criteria unless the chair or members of the board have anything before we do so.
Mr. Gorman?
Just have one question for city staff. Where throughout the city are these permitted in terms of other zones? And are the size criteria consistent with this one, or does it vary? We can continue, Joe, just get that back from them whenever.
Okay. My question is about the two, you say there's a junction of 2 transmission lines there. Who maintains those lines, and how would you use them?
One is owned by Eversource, Public Service in New Hampshire,
Yep.
and the other is owned by National Grid. So the presence of the existing electric infrastructure would allow for the projects, the energy generated by the project to be put onto the grid. And so part of the design is a substation for the project where it would, what's called interconnect to the existing transmission lines.
You do all that right on site?
On-site, yes.
Okay.
So as to avoid the construction of a transmission line for the purpose of interconnection.
All right.
And that was part of how the applicant chose this site. It's unique, obviously, to see these two utility-scale transmission corridors intersect each other on a spot where I know historically on this site, there'd been some consideration of more traditional development. I don't know that this site works particularly well to perk septic systems, and I know that there hasn't been any real desire from the city to extend municipal services out that way. So it is zoned rural residential. There's an opportunity conceivably on paper to subdivide this, build a road, and put an awful lot of house lots out there. It's not hugely feasible for that use. It's a bit of a difficult site if that's what you were trying to do with it, which makes it a very valuable site for this kind of use, which is lower intensity certainly than houses and school buses and people out there and septic systems, et cetera. So I think creates an interesting buffer use between the conservation lands that surround it. Isn't gonna add a whole lot of people, isn't really gonna add a whole lot. It gets maintained roughly twice a year where some brush cutting, et cetera, gets done, but otherwise it basically sits there and passively generates clean electricity.
Okay. Go ahead and proceed with your criteria then.
If I may, Mr. Chair,
Yes.
just briefly to answer Mr. Gorman's question. So the large-scale solar systems are allowed in the rural district, the BGR district, the corporate park, industrial, and industrial park. All except the industrial would require a CUP through the planning board. Industrial is the only one that's allowed by right use.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, Mike?
Sorry, a question occurred to me as I was looking closely at the site plan. And that is, you are proposing to access the site from Old Gilsum Road from what appears to be the south on this plan. Did you give any consideration to it accessing it from the northern part of Old Gilsum Road? And another question is, when I look at Route 9, or I think it's Route 10, I see what looks like a road coming off of 10 and then heading up to the substation. Am I wrong in seeing that as a road? Is it a canal or a waterway or?
Yeah, I
something like
believe that here is.
Yes.
That appears to be delineated wets.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
then.
a small stream.
And then in terms of the access on Old Gilsum Road, the Conservation Commission also raised that same question, and it is very much on our radar. I don't have a good answer for you right now, other than to say that we are considering it as part of a more definitive site plan. We can certainly consider that access. Right now, we're still in the preliminary phases, but that has been brought to our attention. So granting the variance would not be contrary to the public interest because the city has, over 2 mayoral regimes, made a decision that's been accepted throughout the city that green energy is a good thing for public interest. It's an opportunity to reduce reliance on fossil fuels, a nice move into the future for Keene and Cheshire County and New Hampshire at large. And there's a goal to reduce or to go entirely to renewable energy by 2030 as part of the Sustainable Energy Plan. And if the city is going to meet those lofty goals, it requires permitting uses like this. I think it'd be a hard argument to say that providing green energy isn't in the public interest, and we certainly believe that it is. And as such, we believe this project meets that criteria. Again, if the variance were granted, the spirit of the ordinance would be observed. It's, again, taken in conjunction with criteria 1. The goal of the ordinance appears to be promoting clean energy in appropriate locations. And again, that's why that 20-acre amount seems to have been picked. It seemed like a reasonable choice to not be too small. I know that we're all in a building that has solar panels on the roof, and those certainly have a benefit for the building and provide a good feeling when you see them, but they don't do enough to really make a huge dent toward that 2030 goal of reducing fossil fuel energy. It really requires permitting large projects like this. And I think that's, the ordinance clearly has considered that we need green energy options and they need to be in reasonable places. There's a conditional use permit included in it so that this will be thoroughly vetted by the planning board. We expect we'll be back in front of the zoning board once we have a more definitive site plan. Certainly can already see, as mentioned, a couple places we're going to need relief. So the city, through conservation, through the state, through this board, through the planning board, is going to have a lot of opportunities to look at this project and make sure it really does comport with the goals of the ordinance and the past, the various resolutions that have been passed in the clean energy plan. But we do certainly think it's in the spirit of the ordinance to be able to permit some of these larger projects in the city. Granting the variance would do substantial justice. This is, again, the balancing test of private rights and public benefits. Unlike some projects where you have to figure out if this is going to hurt the public, would it do so less than it will help the private applicant? Here, the public benefits are great in that it provides clean energy to the region. It's going to be a tax generator with very few, if any, public services required. Again, you're not educating kids here. You're not adding municipal services. You don't have to plow. There's really no cost to the town other than the fact that this will produce tax revenue, and also during creation and installation, it creates a large number of construction jobs. And then the private benefits to the owners and applicant are fairly evident, in that the owners of this lot have leased the property to Glenvale, who is in this business and does a good job with this, picks reasonable projects and works hard to make sure that they are as good as possible for generation, for the municipality, et cetera. So in terms of balancing the goods, it's really good on both sides of the ledger here, as far as we can tell. So I do certainly think it achieves substantial justice through that balancing framework. If the variance were granted, the values of surrounding properties would not be diminished. Again, we're in an interesting location where we're by two of the more major thoroughfares into the city, and we've proposed a project where overall it's 30 acres on one lot of solar, 135 on the other, and with clearing and roadways, et cetera, it ends up being about 240 acres of disturbed land on 480 acres of the two parcels combined. So we're using about half the space, meaning that certainly there's woodland buffers and being careful to do proper wetlands delineations and be mindful of those things, have the opportunity to make sure that we don't unduly put this in a spot where it is visible to neighbors. It's also a very sparse part of this city. There's, beyond the recreation uses out there, there are not hugely active uses, so no one's gonna have to look at this from their window the way you would if you were building 20 acres downtown somewhere. Again, we understand that people appreciate the trail networks, but this is privately owned land, so I think it's understandable that the owners and now through the applicant would like to have a viable use for this, but the neighboring lots are generally in conservation, and then obviously there's the important Goose Pond area, which is an important recreational area for the town, for the city. This is a really nice buffer option from Route 10 and Route 9 to know that you have something there that isn't going to add a whole bunch of people, isn't gonna add aggressive construction over the course of years if you were to build a subdivision with a proper roadway through there. It's just gonna be a low impact, and I think it's gonna be beneficial for the neighbors as well. All right, unnecessary hardship owing to the special conditions of the property that distinguish it from the other properties in the area. Denial of the variance would result in unnecessary hardship. Again, this is a unique property in Keene. One of the things I looked at while trying to figure out what other parcels sort of feel like this in the city, and again, for a couple of you that weren't here at the last meeting, I did grow up here, so I'm familiar with the area, obviously. The people at Glenvale look for parcels that make sense to redevelop as solar. One of their considerations in that, if you think about where there are wide open parcels that don't have a more active use, you run into things like farms and uses that they'd rather not redevelop as solar because those already do have a viable use. So this is a spot that's very difficult to develop as a single family residential or any of the other allowed residential uses in this zone. So we're trying to find a place where we're not taking land that could be put to a better use and put something that does benefit the public and benefit the community through that green energy installation. Just out of curiosity, I was looking to see what sort of parcels are around these sizes, and if this is 380 combined, or 480 combined acres, for example, the Keene Country Club is only 148 acres. So this is a big, unique parcel where really nothing's developed. Old Gilsum Road is Class 6. It's unmaintained by the city. There are not a lot of great options for something that could be developed at this. It's a unique site. It's a difficult lot. Lacks value for almost all the other uses, and this is something where you really can provide a good and a reasonable use. But in terms of the unnecessary hardship, if we're to take that many acres and put 20 acres of solar panel, it really seems like a bit of a waste of the entire parcel, and that it's both still burdened by these transmission lines, and then it's burdened by a small solar panel but not really usable for anything else. So it's an opportunity where it feels unreasonable to use such a small percentage of the parcel for that. And then I guess there's an opportunity, maybe you could build a subdivision road and subdivide a whole bunch of 20 or 25 acre parcels and do this. But so you have an alternative which is not required under the Malachi Glen standard or Simplex or any of the cases that lead to our hardship definitions, but that's an unreasonable use of capital, and to break this down so that you can build something reasonable with relief here, to take all those extra steps that don't do any good for the community, because a roadway certainly isn't generating green energy if we had to put one in to try to make this a usable parcel. So I think the 20 acres is just an unreasonable use based on the unique circumstances of being near a couple highways, near 2 transmission lines, and really in a perfect spot where no one's going to see it. It's not gonna be visible. It's not gonna emit noise. It's just a great spot for it. And then, again, the proposed use is reasonable. In that Malachi Glen case, they discussed the fact that an allowed use is inherently reasonable. Solar, large scale, is an allowed use. The city knows and has codified it into the ordinance that we want to promote green energy. We want to promote solar uses. So I think based on both the ordinance and the case law, it's an inherently reasonable use.
Mike?
I'm glad you brought up the hypothetical of subdividing and going about it that way and staying within 20-acre contiguous, because I wondered that myself. And I was wondering if you could spend just a little bit of time describing that process. Would a road have to be built and then application for subdivision in 20 plus or minus acre parcels would have to be approved by planning board? And then you could purchase those parcels and build solar panels on them?
Yeah.
In
and
theory.
Again, the case law has held that just because there is an alternate method, it doesn't mean that there isn't a hardship. I think you're certainly familiar with that. But if we were to do that, and again, I've looked at it briefly because I'm a land use attorney and this is my particular brand of nerdiness. I like considering what you can do on these parcels. We're coming off a couple difficulties if we were to do so. A, that Old Gilsum Road is class 6 and seems to be a borderline cart path for most of it. We did stake out to figure out what the right of way looked like. But then to build off a class 6 road, a subdivision approved road, you're building to city standards. Certainly there's waiver options for all of this and we can continue rolling the dominoes, but you get into more and more things which I think take us farther and farther from reasonable, when with this relief we could just build what makes sense rather than having multiple parcels without the setbacks. The other thing that I think Ari could speak to better is that the more you spread these out, even if we were to build the exact same amount of solar panels around town, you lose in efficiency. If you could speak to that just briefly.
Absolutely. So going back to the sort of the founding principle for the company, which again was to generate clean, reliable energy that's also affordable. Part of that strategy involves achieving economies of scale. And so to pursue a larger project, you're both able to get more energy generation out of a smaller footprint, as well as have fewer interconnections like we were discussing, which all contributes to reducing the cost of the electricity. And so, to generate the same amount of energy that this project would generate from 20-acre parcels would require a far larger, footprint. Part of that's related to the buffers that would need to be, around the project to allow sun to hit the panels. And so more projects would be a greater perimeter. And then it would also be far more need to interconnect into the existing electric grid. And that being one of the single largest costs of a project would significantly drive up the cost of energy that would have to be, as it would be sold to customers. And so, again, our thinking in pursuing these types of projects is specifically to drive down the cost of clean energy.
To the end users,
Yes.
which would be residents of New Hampshire.
Mr. Gorman?
Safe to say that the whole subdivision route, which would be acceptable from a zoning perspective, fair to say that not only is it not equitable, but it would probably have more impact to the whatever biodiversity that exists in these areas.
I do think it's fair to say that. Again, we do have an environmental scientist and engineers on this. So again, lawyers aren't probably the best equipped to play at those two trades, but this has been designed in such a way that we can try to avoid as much of the wetlands as we can, and certainly being mindful of DES regs and the local Concom's concerns. We're going to do our best to, we're not going to do our best, we're going to comply with the regulations and make sure that the site works. Whereas if we were to just parcel this off into 20, 25, 30 acre parcels, it's really unclear where those boundaries would be. So if you build a center road the way we've all looked at subdivision plans, it's sort of.
At the end of the day, you'd have more roads, more infrastructure, more impact on the natural surroundings.
I think that's a very strong possibility and probability.
Okay, thank you.
what would you say is the general public purpose of the ordinance that you want varied here?
I think the public purpose of the Keene solar ordinance is to have properly sized solar arrays in correct locations in town. And I think that works in conjunction with the conditional use permit. It gives the city another chance to make sure that these are sited correctly, that they're not just anywhere you can fit 20 acres of solar panels. And I think that, again, the variance is required because the 20 acres makes sense on a 30-acre, 40-acre parcel. We're in that unique parcel where we are so much larger than what was considered in the ordinance that the ordinance stops being reasonable.
Any other questions? I have one, I think. On your application form, under section 2, property information, you speak, the permeable lot coverage, I'm a little confused about why they're at 0. When solar panels are gonna cover, I don't know, some odd, several hundred acres.
In terms of the proposed, I would argue for correction that I don't have it at 0. I have it as not answered, and in part because we don't have the final determination, we don't have the final site plan.
Okay.
Again,
I'll stand corrected then. You have 0 under existing and you don't have anything answered. You're right, okay. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'm not sure how else to answer, Mr. Chairman.
If I may, Mr. Chair. So the solar for the impervious is certainly a unique, trying to, figure out what would be the impervious, since the panel's not actually, preventing water from migrating into the ground. So under our ordinances, instead of impervious surfaces for solar footprint, we actually look at the percentage that it's covering just in general, not calling it impervious. And there's a limitation of 70% of a site would be able to be covered by the panels themselves, with the understanding, obviously, that the impervious would be a very low number, since it's not, the solar panels are not preventing the water to making it to the ground.
Is that because these panels are not covering the ground, as demonstrated by that picture?
Correct. In most cases, what you'll see is that mounted, especially with ground mounted, there'll be, and I can certainly let the applicant speak to that. He has a lot more experience about that than I do, but it would be, really most of the time a pole that's mounted with, certainly with some, structure, some foundation structure, but it's not like that whole panel is covering the ground itself. So we do have under our section that does, again, limit the footprint to 70% of the parcel.
So if granting this variance, would we exceed that 70% in this case?
No.
No, as I think the applicant spoke to before, I think in total between the two lots, it was closer to probably about a 50%. But again, I won't
Okay.
speak to, and that's still without an actual design plan in front of us. And but as part of their application, I do believe they mentioned 50%.
All right, that answers my question. Any others for the moment, for the applicant? Okay. I guess at this time, you guys, gentlemen, have anything more to add, based on the questions?
No, again, I appreciate you taking the time to consider this application.
Thank you.
I do think that this is a really good project for the city of Keene, and I hope that you'll consider that this variance really is a first step. There is a lot of vetting still to be done, but this is really what would give us the opportunity to design a great project here so that it could be built. This is really the gatekeeper.
And I would just echo what Eli has said, and to say thank you, and that, this is a project that we believe to be very compelling in its use, and appreciate your consideration.
Thank you very much. All right, if you gentlemen are done, we'll take comments from people opposed to the project. If you want to identify yourself and step up to the mic.
You mean the public?
Yes.
Oh, good. Hello. My name is Bob King. I live at 42 Hurricane Road. And Mr. Jackson, Counselor, thank you for coming to our fair city.
Did you say 42 Hurricane?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks.
I've been in the renewable energy field for my entire professional life. I'm a professional engineer, and one of my companies owns the Keene Wastewater Treatment Plant Solar, which I'm told is the largest solar project in the county at 1,360 kilowatts DC. I spoke to the Earth Day rally last weekend, and I sort of challenged people to break our record as having the largest solar plant in the county. And then I followed it up with saying, as long as you site it in the right location and not in the middle of a forest. So again, I commend you for your vision and for suggesting large-scale solar. I just think putting it in the middle of a forest, which happens to be in a prime conservation focal area, is just not the right site. It leads to forest fragmentation. Mr. Gorman mentioned biodiversity. You know, together with the climate crisis is the biodiversity crisis, and protecting our forests and wild places is key to the future for non-human species as well as humans. As an engineer, I might point out a few other things. You implied that this is the most efficient way to do solar. I don't think that's true. I think it's actually more efficient from a technical standpoint having solar on individual household rooftops. It's more profitable to have it in one large conglomeration. And nothing against the profit motive, I'm a capitalist myself, but let's just be clear, it's actually more efficient to generate electricity where it's being used if your goal is to help Keene Community Power and power the homes and businesses in Keene. Thus, my final comment, really the place for this kind of solar is on all our rooftops, particularly the big box stores, smaller homes, parking lots, on canopies, the Keene landfill, you know, any brownfields we have. You know, I did a little research ahead of time, and in Massachusetts, where your company is headquartered, Mass Audubon, Mass DOER, that's the Department of, or Division of Energy Resources, and US EPA all discourage this kind of solar development in favor of the things that I just listed: parking lots, rooftops, abandoned gravel pits, dumps. Keene landfill is a perfect application. So I just hope you consider this as you consider this variance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there any member of the public who wants to speak opposed to the application? Just step up to the microphone, state your name and where you live, and provide us your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the board for this opportunity. My name is Ryan Owens, and I'm speaking tonight on behalf of the Monadnock Conservancy, of which I'm the executive director. The Monadnock Conservancy is a nonprofit land conservation trust based in Keene. Our office is at 15 Eagle Court and serving the greater Monadnock region. To date, we've conserved more than 23,000 acres of forests, farms, and wetlands across the region in order to perpetuate the public benefits that these properties provide in their primarily undeveloped state. This includes more than 500 acres of permanently conserved forest immediately north of this proposed development. I want to start by saying the Conservancy applauds the city's goal of sourcing all electricity from 100% renewable sources by 2030, and there are likely many locations around the city where we would support the development of solar on this scale of this proposal or even larger. The location chosen for Keene Meadow Solar Station, however, being remote, intact forest and surrounded by conservation land, is not one of them. We oppose granting the requested variances for the following reasons, which correspond to the 5 criteria that must be met. Criterion number 1, in claiming that granting the variance would not be contrary to the public interest, the applicant correctly states that their project would help meet the city's clean energy goals, thereby serving a public interest. Nevertheless, there are several ways in which granting the variance would be contrary to the public interest. I understand that you were provided some maps that I had submitted in advance. Is that correct, Corinne? Good.
You submitted them today?
Yes.
Okay.
As shown in map number 1, directly to the west and south of the proposed development is, as you know, the City of Keene's 1,044-acre Greater Goose Pond Forest. and directly to the north is the Monadnock Conservancy's 518-acre Maynard Forest. The establishment, expansion, and management of these forests represents a significant, sustained public and charitable investment in the public interest served by these properties in this area of Keene. In particular, the public benefit of forests and the ecosystem services they provide, including clean water, wildlife habitat, a sustainable supply of forest products, and recreation. The city's conservation intentions for the Goose Pond Forest, as expressed through master plans, have been clear ever since Goose Pond was retired as a public drinking water source in the early 1980s. What followed was a period of rapid expansion of the forest through the proactive acquisition of adjoining properties, and in 2019, the city made its intentions irrevocable by granting a permanent conservation easement on the entire property to the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. By clearing and developing a swath of forest on the scale proposed immediately adjacent to and between the Goose Pond and Maynard forests, the Keene Meadow Solar Project would harm the ecological integrity and function of these and other surrounding forests. The wildlife habitat values of the lots that are the subject of these applications and the greater area are particularly significant. As shown in Map 2, the entire area proposed to be impacted by this development is ranked in the top 3 tiers of wildlife habitat quality in the New Hampshire Wildlife Action Plan, a publication of New Hampshire Department of Fish and Game, and more than half the area is in the top 2 tiers. These, in turn, are part of a larger block of priority habitat to the north and west. Only 2 other areas of Keene host high-quality habitat on this scale. The entire block functions as an ecological unit, so when one part is compromised by development, the function and value of the entire block is diminished. The protection of wildlife habitat is a matter of public interest, and the 20-acre solar limit in the ordinance helps to serve that interest in locations of high habitat value. As such, granting the variances would be contrary to the public interest, we believe. As shown in Map 3, the subject area is part of a network of priority wildlife habitat blocks linked by wildlife corridors. At a larger scale, both the proposed project site and the adjacent conserved forest anchor the southern end of an important north-south corridor, which is itself part of a larger network of corridors extending from the northern edge of downtown Keene to conserved land in Surrey, Gilsum, Sullivan, Stoddard, and beyond. Such corridors are critical not only for seasonal wildlife movement, but also for long-term needs for habitats to shift north in response to climate change. Granting the requested variances disrupts the continuity and function of these corridors and therefore harms the public interest served by them. And criteria number 2, and these are much shorter. In claiming that the spirit of the ordinance would be observed if the variances were granted, the applicant states that the goal of the ordinance, quote, appears to be promoting green energy projects in appropriate locations. While this is likely true, it is equally likely that the 20-acre solar footprint cap was also an expression of the goal or spirit of the ordinance. That is, while the ordinance seeks to promote solar energy, it also seeks to limit its impact on the landscape. As such, to exceed this limit to such a large degree clearly runs counter to the spirit of the ordinance. Criteria 3 and 4. In addressing criteria 3 and 4, the applicant claims that neighboring properties will not be harmed because the solar installations will be screened from view and are far from nearest residential development. As the owner of a neighboring property, we disagree. Though the solar project, if built at the proposed scale, may not diminish the monetary value of surrounding properties, for the reasons explained previously, it will unquestionably diminish their ecological value. Finally, on criterion 5, in claiming unnecessary hardship, the applicant describes the properties as unique due to the presence of wetlands and the lack of access to roads, public water, and public sewer. However, criterion 5 challenges the applicant to distinguish their property from other properties in the area. And these same limitations of wetlands, access, and utilities apply to nearly every property in that part of Keene. The applicant also argues that the application of the 20-acre limit in the ordinance to their property fails to advance the purpose and intent of the ordinance, and that their proposed use is reasonable. Again, they seem to be asserting that the only purpose and intention of the ordinance is to advance solar development, failing to acknowledge that the included 20-acre limit is just as significant an expression of purpose and intent. Had the ordinance not intended to limit the footprint of solar development, it would not have included such a limit. And therefore, I I urge you to decline to grant these variances. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to speak to just,
Let me just ask if there are any more comments opposed. I'll give you a chance to respond. Hold
thank
on.
you.
There is a hand.
Yeah,
Come on up.
thank you. Hi, I'm Ann Faulkner. I'm at 42 Hurricane Road in Keene. Turn it down. So you've heard some technical ideas from Bob. You've heard some scientific thoughts from Ryan, and I agree with all of them. And as I'm sitting here listening to things, I feel like I have a couple additional things. One is sort of an aesthetic issue, and one is sort of emotional. The aesthetic thing has to do with looking at solar panels, and the applicants have talked about how, you know, hiding it in the woods is really great because nobody has to see it. And I feel like we should be able to see where our energy comes from, and we should be proud of seeing solar panels on our roofs and alongside our highways or on our dump or whatever it is, that we shouldn't have to hide these things. It's part of embracing our clean energy future is to see where our energy comes from. I also just want to say, sort of, this is sort of my emotional reaction, is that when you guys say there's, you know, no other viable alternative for this land, you know, growing trees, sequestering carbon, supporting wildlife and recreation are viable uses. They might not have the financial return of a solar farm, but, you know, they're certainly of public value to everybody. And then I have a question, which I don't know is, I think it's for the city, and maybe it's not appropriate to ask, but I've been wondering if the planning department or anybody has done an inventory of prospective sites in Keene where you could have a 20-acre or a 10-acre or just rooftops, and, you know, have you guys looked at the dump? And, you know, if, you know, I think it's great that the city has these goals for renewable energy, and I'm just wondering if you've sort of done some mapping of what the options are in Keene, besides doing things in the middle of the woods.
If I may, Mr. Chair. So no,
Thank you.
we have not done an overall inventory. Obviously, certainly with the LDC, we took into some consideration, certainly allowing for, tried to expand the ability for the rooftop to occur, making it more of an accessory type use that would be allowed pretty much on any piece of property, as long as it's accessory to the uses that are on that property. But doing an overall inventory of available lots or locations, no, that is not something that we had expanded into.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public opposed to the application? Seeing none, I will go to comments in
Excuse me,
support.
Mr. Chair, I apologize. There is a letter in the folder in opposition from Eloise Clark.
I think I remember seeing that. I'm not finding it, but this is in the packet.
Yes, it is in the packet. I was just reading it. It's,
If
looks
it-
like it's page 65 and 66, Joe.
Right, I've got it. Now,
For
Does it-
clarification, is that Ms. Clark that's on the Conservation Commission? Thank you.
I don't know personally, it doesn't say it on, it is, okay. Is the consensus of the board to read this into the record, or is having it part of the packet sufficient?
Is the applicant aware of the letter? Has he?
Have you seen the letter?
I have not seen the letter.
I think in
I'll read
fairness
it.
to his rebuttal, we should read it.
I'll
in
read
the-
it. So this is from Eloise Clark, I'm sorry. And it's dated April 3rd. I'm sorry, it's not dated April 3rd, it's for tonight's meeting. I guess it doesn't carry a date. She writes, "I would like to comment on the proposed zoning changes to the rural district at 0 Gilsum Road in Keene to accommodate the development of Keene Meadow Solar Station. Lynn M. Thomas and Cynthia Brown Richards are the landowners requesting the changes. This is an enormous industrial-scale development in the rural district. According to the packet we received at the Keene Conservation Commission meeting, the development will encompass 240 acres, This includes 75 acres of solar panel modules alone, plus batteries and inverters, a substation, roads, storage areas, cleared areas, and buffers between and around the modules. Allowing a development of this scale would set the precedent for other areas of the rural district to be developed, perhaps with less desirable industries. Once the precedent is set, the door will be open to other development. Stormwater management will be a challenge with the creation of such a large area of impermeable surface. Excessive runoff of precipitation to the east would impact the Beaver Brook watershed. To the west, it will impact the greater Goose Pond forest. Flooding can be an issue for the valley floor of Keene. The best protection from increased flooding in Keene is to keep the steep hillsides and upland areas forested. Site preparation, converting land from forest to meadow involves removing tree stumps over many acres. Bulldozing removes and disturbs productive forest soils. The loss of both forest cover and soils eliminates the existing intact, healthy ecosystem. For example, salamanders that live most of the year in these upland soils would be eliminated. Much of their population would be unable to return to the existing vernal pools. Old Gilsum Road would need to be upgraded to accommodate heavy machinery during construction. It would also need to be maintained so truck traffic can access the site for maintenance. The road is used by many pedestrians and bicyclists, creating a conflict in use. The greater Goose Pond forest and surrounding area is heavily used for recreational purposes by large numbers of people. An industrial facility is not compatible. Power generation, because of the nature of the electrical grid, power generated at the site would flow into the larger electrical stream. It would not necessarily go directly to Keene. My recommendation, this is Ms. Clark's recommendations. 1, keep a healthy forest intact. Young trees will continue to sequester or absorb carbon from the atmosphere at an accelerated rate for the first 60 years of their growth. Mature trees will store carbon for centuries beyond the 40-year lifespan of this installation. 2, encourage solar development in waste areas such as the former Kingsbury site. The Keene Transfer and Recycling Station has sunny areas perfect for an installation. Many commercial parking lots sit half full of vehicles. Light industry is often surrounded by large acreage. For example, the area proposed for storage units on Optical Avenue. Why not solar installations there? Please use these areas first. 3, building rooftops. There are many acres of commercial, manufacturing, and residential building rooftops that could house solar panels. With proper battery storage, these sites could spawn a movement toward decentralized electric grid. This type of energy generation would be less subject to the recent outages that have affected so many in recent months. Thank you for your attention to this letter. I recognize you have a difficult choice to make. Sincerely, Eloise Clark, 1185 Roxbury Road, Keene, New Hampshire. That is the end of the letter. Any other comments in opposition? I'm going to turn now to comments in support. Seeing none, I'll turn the floor over to the applicant for rebuttal.
I know we've spent quite a bit of time on this. I'll be brief. Wildlife movement corridors were brought up, and this is an important part of any development project, including this one. A couple of the things that have been considered here. As mentioned, we do have a wildlife scientist on the staff for this project, and one of the things I can tell you definitively is that the fencing around this will be of a type that smaller animals can get through. Basically, I think anything smaller than a deer will be able to go through these, so that migration corridors and that central wetlands area, et cetera, will all be kept intact with proper buffers. So that is something that the applicant has considered. There was a question about the unique nature of these parcels, because it is a bunch of forested, less developed parcels in the area. This is the only location up there that has 2 transmission lines intersecting. Really, X marks the spot for this situation. In terms of visuals, I don't disagree. Visuals, and also in terms of what Mrs. Clark said about putting things in town, I like that they're on the building here. I think it's great to have them on garages. It is a good job for all of us to do our part, and we're certainly not trying to hide these because we don't think it's a good thing to promote green energy. As mentioned previously, there are trails. The public has been welcome to this site, and the public will remain welcome to this site. If they want to walk, I'm sure we can have trails so that people can see the glory that is a large solar facility if that's something they want to, but it won't be visible from the road. To Mrs. Clark's letter, you obviously all know this, but for the benefit of the public, zoning board's a non-precedential body. Just because we get something doesn't mean your neighbor gets it. Just because you can build a deck with a zoning board variance to allow you 1 foot in a setback doesn't change the zoning in the city. And then one of the other considerations here is that I feel for what the abutters have said here, and we do recognize the benefit of conservation forests. This is a forest that's been extensively logged. It's an active use. We're talking about conservation restrictions on neighboring lots, which are a wonderful, beneficial thing for the city, for the state, et cetera. This is private property. There are certain uses that are allowed by right on this property, including single-family residential development. And with the acreage we've discussed, we certainly could figure out, the owners could figure out a way that if they wanted to put that in there, it's gonna be a lot of site work and expense, but it's gonna be an awful lot of disruption, whereas solar on this use allows the water to run under them, allows the wildlife corridors to exist, basically gets trimmed twice a year, but it's a shrub wetland that would remain for all those areas. It really is a good use where I understand what the abutters have said, that they would prefer that this would be a forest in perpetuity and that it be used for conservation land, but it is private property, and unless the town wants to take this, it's really not what's in front of the board tonight.
Thank you. Any other comments in support of the application?
I would just add to what Eli was saying. There are a lot of individual points made, and I won't try to respond to all of them individually. But from a broad level, going back to what I outlined is the sort of the founding principle of the company, which is, again, to generate energy, clean, reliable energy at an affordable cost. A lot of the considerations that have been expressed, we also scrutinize our projects with that same view. And, in looking at how you can build projects in New England, which is a difficult region to build projects in, as well as, preserve as many of the same values that we have that have been expressed. This, in our view, is still very much a compelling site that has the viability for construction based on both its interconnection as well as the economies of scale that would allow it to sell electricity affordably as well as be financed and actually built.
All right. I don't think I see any other people interested in making any comments one way or another, so I'm going to close the public hearing and we'll begin our deliberations. Thank you both very much.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize. I have a question on procedure in that we have two very similar applications. I don't know if the board prefers to briefly discuss the second application and vote on them in tandem, or?
We would vote on them separately because they're two separate variance applications, but to the extent that you want to, I'll use the phrase piggyback, but you want to discuss your second one prior to the deliberations on the first one. I don't mind if nobody else minds. Might save time in the end. Mr. Gorman?
One other way we could handle it and have in the past is that he could just highlight any differences in his application for that second variance. Likely they would be very brief, so that would save time, but we would be able to just assume that all the things he said previously would apply to the second application as well.
Is that something you'd be agreeable?
Yeah, as we've discussed economies of scale, I think that is the logical place to do so. So
I'll reopen the public hearing for you to take up 2312, which let me just read that in the record and then have staff comment on it if they wish. Petitioner Keene Meadow Solar Station LLC of Boston, Mass., represented by A. Eli Lino of Bernstein, Shears, Sawyer, and Nelson of Manchester, New Hampshire, requests a variance for property located at 0 Old Gilsum Road, tax map 213-006, 3 sets of triple zeros, is in the rural district and is owned by Platts Lot LLC of West Swansea, New Hampshire. The petitioner requests to permit 135-acre large-scale ground-mounted solar energy system where 20 acres is allowed, per Chapter 100, Article 8.3.7.c, .2, lower b of the zoning regulations. Gentlemen, do you want to add anything more to your first round of comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to be thorough, this 135 acres, there are no buildings, and there are no ZBA applications on file.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gorman?
One quick question, just because I have you, Mike. What's the list of allowed uses for this property?
If you want to let him speak, I can get that information and get it back to you.
Thank you.
For the sake of completeness of the record, I would like to cite our testimony on the previous hearing to be brought into this. Again, the sites are abutting. The parcel has been preliminarily designed really as one total use of that 480 acres. This would be 130 acres of solar on a 302-acre parcel. Again, transmission corridors, et cetera. I don't think I need to belabor the point if the board feels that the testimony from the previous hearing was enough to adequately discuss the 5 criteria.
Yes, Mike?
I do have a question, and maybe I've forgotten if we've ever done it in the past, but part of the variance that's sought is a relief for access via Class 6 highway so that they can apply for a street access permit. Is that something this board would grant? Is that variance?
That's, I thought it was for subdivisions in residential areas. That there's a statute on that.
If I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
So this would be the access for this would need to be granted through the city council. I think the applicant's aware of that, and would be a process further down. The statute you're speaking to would allow development on a Class 6 road, but it does require the approval of the city council.
Okay. Is that part of the conditional use permitting?
It's
You mentioned-
its own piece, Mr. Chairman, if I may. So the preliminary application references that, and then, as you know, I re-noticed the 0 Gilsum Road because I had a scrivener's error where I referred to them both as Old Gilsum Road,
Right.
whereas one. So I took out that piece. I was curious to see if it would come up. I wasn't hugely familiar with the city comprehensive land use code as opposed to being a zoning ordinance, so I saw a provision in there and thought I need relief from that, therefore I will apply for a variance. Mr. Rogers correctly told me, and we had some spirited discussion of this, that is in the comprehensive code but is under the city council's jurisdiction, so I don't need relief from that. And then we also had a lively discussion of road frontage versus frontage, which are different in your ordinance, and we've reached the point where it's determined that we don't need that tonight.
So you learned a lot from Mr. Rogers.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right, so is there anything more you want to add on 2312?
No, I believe that citing the testimony previously given, I think there's not much more I can add unless the board has questions, and I will try to be respectful of your time.
Anybody have questions? All right, I will go through the same order of comment as I did before. First, entertaining comments in opposition that are not repetitive. Yes, Mr. Gorman?
Can we get back to Mike real quick for an answer on my question?
Oh, is he ready? Okay, sure. Thanks for the reminder.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Permitted uses in the rural zone found under 3.1.5, dwelling, manufactured housing, dwelling, single-family, manufactured housing park. Commercial uses are animal care facility, bed and breakfast with a special exception, greenhouse, nursery, kennel, congregate living, small, with a conditional use permit, open space uses, cemetery, community garden, conservation area, farming, golf course, gravel pit, with a special exception, and then infrastructure uses, small solar, medium solar, and large solar, telecommunications facility.
Thank you.
Okay. Any further comments or questions before we open this up to the public? So first, we'll hear from those in opposition. Again, without repeating what you had said already, because I think we've already heard that once. And if you have anything new to add as to this application, please step up.
Can we simply say that we oppose this one as well?
Well, come on up and just say that. State your name and you can, for the same reasons or however you want to do it is fine.
Bob King, still at 42 Hurricane, and opposing this one for the same reasons.
Okay, thank you. That'll be in the record.
And Ryan Owens of the Monadnock Conservancy at 15 Eagle Court. If it's acceptable to the board, I'd like our prior comments to apply to both applications.
Certainly, thank you. And Ms. Faulkner, you're next.
Yes, Ann Faulkner, 42 Hurricane Road.
Still.
Same comments.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. All right, anybody want to add anything more to that?
Same rebuttal.
Okay. And does anybody else in the public want to speak in favor? Okay, now we'll close the public hearing and proceed to deliberations on both applications.
Thank you.
I think we should take them probably separately as we discuss it. Anybody want to give it a crack? Start the process? I'm happy to start. Overall, without really focusing on any one of the criteria, I am persuaded that there's a public interest involved in this application, and it's supportive of that interest. There is a master plan in this city with an idea towards green energy, and this plan does promote that. I'm pretty comfortable with the applicant's responses in terms of wildlife and forest management, and I know that's going to get a further look down the road. I do think the balancing test strikes in a remarkably unusual way in that the public and the private benefits are both impacted, and they're not really negatively impacted, in my view. The hardship piece to this is the most interesting, though. The size of the lots, the fact that there are these transmission lines there. We haven't seen a description of a property that's similar to that. So I think I'm considering all those things in this application. But I've just jumped from, all of them except the fourth criteria, but I don't see much diminution in surrounding property values from this application. So I don't see any evidence of that happening. Mr. Gorman?
Well, I think it's important we address each of these criteria individually, just for the record, especially in light of the recent legislature regarding that. So I guess I'll begin briefly with the public interest. This is a tough one because I appreciate the efforts of the Conservancy and appreciate hiking in these woods myself. I also appreciate the balancing act we find ourselves in with the consumption of fossil fuels and life the way we know it, and realizing that we have a pretty well established realization that our impact is negative and that there are viable solutions, this being one of them, that being solar power. So I think, where land is currently not being used for any practical purpose, albeit good conservation land, it is pointed out and noted that it's private land, and not subject to the opinions of conservationists beyond what the laws would state. I think it's great that there's so much land conserved around this land. I also think it's great that efforts will be made to preserve what can be preserved, and still provide us with the energy that we need in a more sustainable fashion. So for that reason, I think it does support the public interest. The spirit of the ordinance, you know, I can't help but note that all three size solar structures are allowed in this zone. So I think the spirit of the ordinance was certainly to propagate or promote solar activity in this zone. The size exception, you know, I think the lay of the land, so to speak, and the abundance of land in correlation with the 20-acre amount that's allowed, I think that is cause for an exception. This is a nearly 300-acre plot where we'll have 30 acres of solar power. So I can get my head around number 2 and the substantial justice part. I don't know how else they could use this land that would not have an adverse impact on the environment. That's why I requested to understand what the other allowed uses were, and as we made our way through the list, I found that all of them would impact the natural habitat. So I think that justice being allowing use of the property would be served reasonably here with the solar farm. The values would not be diminutized in my estimation, and we didn't really hear any argument or basis that would indicate so. And I think the unique nature of the property does provide hardship. The location with the other electrical power stations makes it a very viable and reasonable use, and I think the other allowed uses are not as reasonable. So I think this land does create some hardship, and this use alleviates it of that hardship.
Mr. Welsh?
In reading this application over and thinking about it before we came here tonight, the thing that stuck in my mind was just the scale of the difference between what's permitted by code and what's being asked for. And you know, it points in the narrative and the presentation by the applicant. I've heard some definition of what the public interest is in this situation, but I think more than anything else, the Land Development Code defines that public interest for the purpose of the board, and it says 20 acres. But as I'm listening to the presentation, as I'm trying to figure out why 20 acres and not an endless amount of acres or 50 acres or something that would, you know, decrease the margin of the scale between what's being asked and what's permitted, I'm not really hearing why 20 is the number. And I'm also hearing that adherence to 20 is potentially feasible, though very expensive, and if actually pursued, probably more harmful to some of the conservation values that I think the 20 aims to protect than permitting a larger scale. So I'm convinced or persuaded that granting the variance would not, on balance, be contrary to the public interest. The value, the spirit of the ordinance, again, it's the resolution versus the Land Development Code. There is an argument here that if one, then two, in the application, that if criteria number 1 is satisfied, then criteria number 2. I'm not sure I buy that, but I hear it sounds interesting. And the diminishment of value to surrounding to surrounding landowners. I find compelling that there is value in conservation value of the surrounding properties. And I'm not quite sure that is not measured or argued for here, but I'm not sure where that argument ends in other areas where people are making applications too. So I'm not sure where my head is on the diminishment of value. The others I'm eager to hear and still thinking.
Look, I have a few comments. I think on the fourth criterion, the issue of value, unfortunately, the law is pretty clear about value meaning monetary. And it doesn't really address intangible value like conservation land or enjoyment of natural beauty and things like that. So I feel confined by that definition in terms of how I'm assessing it. So, and I guess that may be regrettable, it may not be, but that's my point of view. Now, the special conditions of the property seem to me to be the size and the coincidental location of the intersection of the power lines. Now, the 20-acre limitation seems to me arrived at when they look at sort of the average size of a rural district lot, and they figure it would have been better if it would have been proportional, but it's not, so we can't really address that. But to me, there is no fair and substantial relationship between the limit 20 and the size of the land. In fact, it creates the unnecessary hardship because there's a lot of room there to do what they want to do. Overall, very little impact in terms of the imperviousness of the ground and the way they're going to manage other features of the land, like the wildlife migration and the water flows. I don't think I agree with Ms. Clark's comments about water flow and flooding. I certainly don't agree with that. But in any event, I find unnecessary hardship satisfied here. And I mentioned the other ones earlier. I spoke to the fourth criterion. I don't know if there's anything more I need to add, but Mr. Cleft, do you want to chime in? No, okay, safe call. Does anybody want to add anything else? Josh?
I would just note in agreement with both yourself and Michael that there is undoubtedly an impact to the conservation land by developing this. I just don't think it's financial, as you suggested. I think that it is what number 4 asks specifically is about the actual financial value of surrounding properties. So.
Yeah, if you put a dump in the residential neighborhood, would it hurt property values?
Right.
Yes. Correct.
And just, and this is useful to me to know that there's, case law establishing that financial is the criteria. Because I was thinking also, if someone places an object or a house or some other development in a permitted, something of that sort in a particular lot, and it's not pleasant to look at, but it doesn't do anything to the property values, I could make an argument that this diminishes my use or my enjoyment of the property. But if financial value is the basis, then.
That's what I think they mean when they discuss that in the cases.
Yeah.
That's my interpretation. Mr. Gorman?
I would just say that maybe if you were going to have some sort of other non-financial impact, you could probably place that in number 1 under public interest in terms of rightful, peaceful enjoyment.
And there I was thinking that part of what people enjoy about all of this land is the ability to walk on it and, exercise and see things. And it does not sound like the applicant intends to limit that. And it sounds like there's some room for movement as the application moves forward to consider those kinds of uses.
And I guess from that point of view, there'll be certainly other opportunities for people who care about those issues to speak their mind. Our focus here is quite narrow. Does anybody have anything else they wish to add in the deliberation? Seeing none, then we should take up the criteria one by one. Will granting the variance be contrary to the public interest? Let me rephrase that. Granting the variance will not be contrary to the public interest. All those in favor, raise your right hand.
We should get a motion first.
Oh, I'm ahead of myself. Is there a motion first? Mr. Gorman?
I would move that we approve, bear with me, ZBA 2311.
I'll second that. Now we'll go to the question. Granting the variance will not be contrary to the public interest. All those in favor? Unanimous. If the variance were granted, the spirit of the ordinance would be observed. All those in favor? Again, unanimous. Granting the variance would do substantial justice. All those in favor? Unanimous. If the variance were granted, the values of the surrounding properties would not be diminished. All those in favor? Is that an, oh, okay, that's 3-1. Mr. Clough is not voting. Oh, all those opposed? Okay, Mr. Clough votes no on that. Owing to the special conditions of the property that distinguish it from other properties in the area, denial of the variance would result in an unnecessary hardship because there is no fair and substantial relationship existing between the general public purpose of the ordinance provision and the specific application of that provision to the property. All those in favor of unnecessary hardship? That's unanimous. Now, on the main motion, all those in favor of approving, now, Josh, I forgot the number. 2312, raise your right hand.
11, Joe.
Oh, I'm sorry, 11. All those in favor? Three in favor, opposed, 1. Motion therefore carries 3-1. We can take up 2312, I guess it is, right? This is the 135-acre parcel. 135-acre request. ZBA 2312, is there a motion on this one? Mr. Gorman?
Well, make a motion to approve, but I also would just like to note that we should carry our comments over from criteria 1 through 5 if city staff deems that appropriate.
I agree.
To avoid redundant deliberations since the applicant and the abutters were so kind in doing so for us. So
Yep, I agree.
With that said, move to approve ZBA 23-12.
I'll second it, and I agree with the comments about incorporating prior comments to this one. First criteria, granting the variance would not be contrary to the public interest. All those in favor? That's unanimous. If the variance were granted, the spirit of the ordinance would be observed. All those in favor? Unanimous. Granting the variance would do substantial justice. All those in favor? That's unanimous. If the variance were granted, the values of the surrounding properties would not be diminished. All those in favor? Oh, same, three, Mr. Clough is voting in the negative, okay. Number 5, unnecessary hardship. Owing to the special conditions of the property that distinguish it from other properties in the area, denial of the variance would result in an unnecessary hardship because there is no fair and substantial relationship existing between the general public purpose of the ordinance provision and its specific application to the property. All those in favor that there's an unnecessary hardship here? That's unanimous. On the main motion, to approve 2312, raise your right hand if you approve. 3 votes in favor. You don't approve, 1 in the negative. Mr. Clough voting in the negative. 2312 is approved.
Thank you very much for your time and consideration of this project. We
Thank you.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Does anybody need a 5-minute recess, or should we continue? Believe it or not, I don't.
Let's march on. If everyone's good.
Good, okay, so we'll go right to,
No? Mike, you want a break? Yeah,
Go
do it. Better now than halfway through.
My mother would kill me if I did.
let's call the meeting back to order. We'll take up case number 2314. The petitioner here requests a variance to allow buildings which cover more than 35% of the lot, impervious surfaces of more than 45% coverage, and less than 55% green/open space per chapter 100, Article 3.3.3 of the zoning regulations. I'll turn it over to city staff for any preliminary comments before we get started.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. 438 Washington Street is located in low density. Existing building on site was built in 1926. The square footage is 19,417 square feet currently. There were 3 variances granted in March. ZBA 2306 for multifamily use, variance 2307, as well as a special exception on for 2308 for parking.
Okay. What was the second one?
The variance on that one.
Multifamily use and something else?
It was for area variance.
Okay.
If I may, Mr. Chair,
Yes,
if we could
Mr.
just
Rogers,
recognize
certainly.
that Attorney Taylor is back as a voting member of
Yes.
the board.
She's back for 2314. And we have Mr. Bragdon on the table, and I don't recognize the other gentleman.
Oh, well, last time I was here, I had a beard. Maybe that's it. It's Josh
Oh,
Meehan.
that could be it.
Josh Meehan from Keene Housing. How are you?
Well, that'll do it every time. Go ahead, Mr. Bragdon.
Yeah, I'm Stephen Bragdon, and I live at 51 Railroad Street in Keene, New Hampshire. I'm here representing Monadnock Affordable Housing Corporation, and who is a subsidiary of Keene Housing. And we're here because we made a mistake at the earlier meeting in that the plan did not include a common area for all of the residents. And I'd let Josh just say a little bit about the necessity for that and
Sure, and I think technically we had one, but it wasn't big enough. So we've just had to increase the size of the community room. So we, all of our properties that we've built recently, and any that are relying on the low-income housing tax credit program for investment for capital to build the properties, are required to have a community space. We had a community space, but long story short, we want to make it a little bit bigger and have a bathroom next to it, attached to it, and an office. And so we're coming back to you all to increase, it's less than 2% increase in what we had come to last time. We actually don't need I don't want to steal all your thunder, by the way, Steve, so, and he'll just correct me. So we don't actually need the 2 we're asking for, we need slightly less than that, but by asking for 2, if we have to push the room out another couple feet for some reason that we don't know yet, we'll be covered and not have to come back again and say, can we have another 0.2% or whatever.
I think the plans that are showing now, and I can't see them really well, but there's we can show you the area in question. I could point it out, but it's on the right side of the bottom part of the plan. One of the plans that we submitted, and candidly, I hate to confess, I really can't see it that well from here, but one of the plans.
I can't see it that well from right here.
The ones one of them we submitted does show the plan from before, and then the new one shows the area that we're increasing, and I think it's the one on the left shows this. Anyway, I'll get to the point. If you want to see it, I can point it out for you. But bottom line is, we're increasing the building by 1.3%. So what that results in is we're requesting a 2% waiver on all of the areas that we asked for before. That was the impervious surface coverage, that was the building coverage, and that was the space green area. So you have granted us permission to go to 28% on the building coverage, impervious coverage of 64%, and green space coverage of 36%. We're asking all of those to be increased by 2%. And again, we don't want to come back here again if we made a small mistake. The actual change is 1.3% increase. So we're asking for 30% impervious surface, building coverage of 30%, impervious surface coverage of 66%, and open space green area of 35%. I would ask that the board members that were here for the previous hearing take into consideration what was said before, and we're prepared to answer any questions at this point, or if you prefer, I'll just go quickly through the criteria.
Why don't you go quickly through the criteria just for the record?
Okay. As was said at the previous meeting, this is the old Roosevelt School. It's unused in its current condition. It's off the tax rolls. This allows some development of the property. There's a significant need for housing in the community. It serves the public interest to allow this development. It serves lower income people. And for that reason, I think it's not contrary to the public interest. If the variance were granted, it's in the spirit of the ordinance because, one, the master plan talks about adoption, adoption and the need for more housing, and the housing density incentive in the conservation residential development of the CRD points to the support for this type of development and the support for reducing the area requirements if it does in fact serve the need of housing. Granting the variance would do substantial justice because any loss to an individual that is not outweighed by a gain to the general public is an injustice. And in this particular case, it's clear that the damage to an individual does not outweigh the general public's interest in this project. If the variance were granted, the surrounding property's value would not be diminished because at the present time, it's a dilapidated, unused building that serves no purpose. And the new building would be much more beneficial to the neighborhood in its appearance and in its use. The unnecessary hardship that there's no fair and substantial relationship between the general public and the purpose of this particular section of the ordinance is because it would allow the use of this existing structure, which otherwise is virtually useless. I mean, I think the only use that could be made of this would be for some entity that wasn't subject to the zoning ordinance to buy it and turn it back into a school. And finally, again, unless we use this, somebody buys it and wants to use it as a school, there's no other feasible way to the use of the premises which does not increase the impervious surface use. And I went through that really quick, and I'll be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Mike?
Just a quick question and a slight concern. You described the need or the reason for the changing percentages in the application, and therefore your reason for being here, as the addition of a larger sized common room and et cetera. But also in the application, I noticed that there's a survey that recalculated the overall acreage of the site from 2.7
That's true, and the I specifically asked this, and the decrease in the area of the lot that was determined after it was surveyed from, I think, 3.7 to 3.13, these calculations were not based on that 3.7 value, area of acres. They were based on the actual acreage that we found that existed there when we did the survey. I saw that in there too, and it was confusing.
So we're pretty sure that the 2% that you're asking for is going to be enough margin.
We certainly hope so.
Okay.
I'm going to send the skinny, younger looking, and more vivacious guy back if that turns out to be the case.
Except he'll have a beard the next time.
With the beard, yes.
Yeah, okay. Mr. Gorman?
This question's probably better suited for Josh. So the federal mandates for these common spaces, is there a size mandate?
Yeah, it's for the low-income housing tax credit program that is administered by New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority. They determine what they like to see in an application, and so they do lay out dimensions for public space, community space, but what we proposed initially, and this one is larger than what is the minimum requirement, but again, we want to have a bathroom right there, and we want to also, very importantly, have an office there so that when there's resident services being delivered that requires some degree of privacy, that there's a place where a resident and our resident service coordinator or some other service coordinator who may be working specifically with somebody have a private place to be.
So, second part of same question, 1.3% is ambiguous to me because I can't see any of these measurements. And how much square footage are we talking here?
I wish I had
Roughly.
the answer to that off the top of my head. That's a really good question.
I'm not sure it's on the plan. Let me go over here. Actually, I have a copy of it here.
I mean, the answer is not much, but I guess it's all relative.
Relative,
So,
yeah.
you know.
Mike?
If I may, Mr. Chair. Just to help answer Mr. Gorman's question.
Go ahead.
Okay. The total square footage of the lot is about 103,595 according to the plan. So at 1%, we're looking about 1,300 square feet of additional space at 1.3, just on average. I'm not doing
Yeah.
exact calculations, but gives you a good
So
idea.
2% would be approximately
2,000 square feet.
2,500 square feet, plus or minus.
Yeah, about 2,000 square feet, a touch over.
Yep.
And we don't anticipate having it be 2%. I just, with what happened the last time, we wished we'd asked for a little more then.
So is this is the last part of my question. The initial room was how big, rough? Like, are you doubling it, you quadrupling it?
No,
or
not
is
doubling it. And again, I apologize. I don't have these numbers, like, these numbers in my head. I can tell you where we are with getting capital and how much all that is. But a third,
Okay, thank you.
and this is entirely my fault, by the way. I made the architects change the plan, so just to be clear, mea culpa.
I wasn't going to say whose fault it was, because I
It's
didn't know.
totally my fault.
You knew it wasn't yours, though.
I have made mistakes in the past.
Nobody's denying that, but
He set you up.
anyway. Ms. Attorney Taylor?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions, just so I understand. So the original plan had a community room, and I'll admit that I can't read these plans that we have either. But that had a community room, so what you're asking for basically is an increase in size for your convenience, basically.
I would say for the convenience of the residents who will be living there, so that they
Yeah,
have a.
but we can't judge for the residents. We
I
have to,
understand,
you
no,
know.
I understand. What we're trying to do is to accommodate the folks who are going to be living there so that they have enough space for the kinds of games and events and things that we typically see in the property.
Yeah, I guess my concern rises considering what we have to look at and the criteria that we have to meet, is that you already have, and this comment would be true if it was 1% or 100%, but you already have the variance that allows you to do something, this particular thing, the community room, but you want an additional variance so you can just have a larger community room.
I think the answer to that is this is a de minimis request. I mean, it's a very small request. If we wanted to completely change this, I think that would be a valid argument. But it's something that was forgotten, that either, and wasn't included, and if it had been included, I believe it would have been granted, and we're here trying to just make sure we comply with all of the rules, and yes, this does increase it slightly, but again, it's de minimis.
Isn't it fair to say, in summary, that the same criteria or the same rationale used to obtain your earlier variance is applicable here, and you would have asked for this amount previously had you realized the mistake?
Yes.
Yes.
So nothing's changed in terms of the reasons for the variance?
Nothing, it's exactly the same, which is why I asked that you recognize that the request that was made originally is, those same arguments apply
Right.
here.
Right. Okay. Anybody have any questions? Any further questions?
Nope.
I don't see any public here to ask, so I think we'll just bypass that. Attorney Taylor?
Yeah, just one thing I thought of, the expanded community room that you want to construct, is that going to be in the same location as on the original plans we saw, or is this going to change any configuration of the buildings?
I seem to remember that we had to move one of the apartments around a little bit to make it work, and that's a part of the need for the change
In which building?
in the school building.
Thank you.
That's the second phase, actually, there. It'll be the other one. There you go, yeah.
That's payback for the tax parcels with the triple zeros.
So I have a plan here. I don't know if it wants to pass it around. I'll circle the area. It's the white area. And I can send that around. And I could.
I can jump
We can show you on the
yeah.
plan there too, but the little white area there.
But at the end of the day, it's not impacting the number of units or anything
staying
like
the
that,
same.
the number of bedrooms, nothing. So
That's
there's no
correct.
material impact from a zoning perspective, maybe from somebody else's viewpoint, but
You're not changing parking, you're not changing square footage of rooms?
Well, except for the
Well, the common
Yeah.
area.
Yeah,
common.
common room's bigger and one of the apartments altered, but
Yes.
number of sleeping rooms not changed.
That is
Number
correct.
of number of
nothing,
units.
nothing is changing other than the having to reorient one of the apartments, and I'm going back a ways in my mind. And, but you're right, that's exactly right. Yeah, please. Oh, sorry.
Just looking at the plans I'm seeing here, and I'll let you know, I think it's the playground area that we're seeing here,
Yep.
that basically now gets infilled as part of the building.
It's right, it ate a little bit of the playground area. Yep.
That's the area where the playground is.
Looks like part of it.
Actually end up having the
Thank you, right.
Where- Is that it right there?
Mr. Chair, if you look at the screen, the area that's circled there now marked out on that screen.
Is that the hash marks?
That's
Yeah, the hash, yeah, it shows on that,
Oh, yeah, okay.
that's the area, that's the increased area that you're seeing, that's white in the middle with the hash around the edges.
All right, I got it. Mike? You got it? You have a better view of it over there. Well, this should be part of the record then.
it is on the, it's now on the screen. No, keep.
Is there anything more you want to add? I mean, my questions are answered.
Not unless there's any questions,
And as I said a moment ago, I don't see any public to address in terms of comments one way or the other, so I think we'll bypass that. Corinne, is there anything, I don't know if anybody's online or anything like that? Good, okay. I'll open it up for public, close the public hearing and deliberate. Mr. Gorman?
I would just briefly like to say that I agree with Attorney Bragdon that had we heard this presented this way, speaking for myself, my outcome wouldn't have been any different. It would have been unbeknownst to me that this was even occurring. I would have just approved the thing for all the same reasons that I did, regardless of the size of the community space that I didn't really even know existed, to be frank. I was more concerned about number of units, parking, benefit to the public, all the things that we touched upon. So without belaboring all those points again, I would say for the record that my response to all 5 of these criteria would be identical to what they were.
I think in March, right?
Yeah, in the March. If we can get a ZBA number for that, that'd be great. ZBA 2306. I would just echo all of my sentiment from that hearing, if that's appropriate.
That's a question I had. It strikes me that everything that we're hearing about tonight is, while it's good that it's here, is fairly de minimis, and I don't really recall any of this being the subject of the original deliberation that resulted in the variance, and I don't see this really changing the variance. And I'm wondering if it might be possible just to sort of bring our discussion and our rationales forward from the March meeting and apply them to the reasons for approval here.
Well, certainly, what I recall, the public interest argument in terms of the public housing need was strong, and there was a lot of public support for that.
There was also a lot of talk and support of the fact that this property is really not viable for any other real purposeful use, and that a vacant property, of course, has a substantial amount of negative impact on a neighborhood.
I only recall one abutter opposed, the neighbor, who would look down on it.
Yeah, and we
That's-
did put in that, the screening.
Yep.
Contingency, or whatever you call it.
Attorney
So,
Taylor,
yeah.
I'm sorry. If you weren't done, go ahead.
No, I'm
Okay.
done. I was rambling.
No comment. Well, I think I probably agree with what's been said, but I do think that we need to create a record on this that's a little more specific. So I'll just go through these briefly and say that clearly the ability to move forward with the public housing option on this property is definitely in the public interest because of what we've said about need for housing and need for this particular type of housing. And that the spirit of the ordinance would be observed, and that was, I think our reasoning was in part because this was kind of an orphan piece of property on the city's records. It was a an educational use, and then it sort of fell into a black hole. So it would be, redevelopment within the concept residential use. This is kind of a transitional area where there's some multifamily housing nearby, so I think it meets that. And again, with the substantial justice, I think it goes back to the public interest. Definitely the public interest, outweighs, I'm not sure what the private benefit would be of staring at a run-down, empty building in a vacant lot. Values, if this development will do anything, I think it may bring up the values of the surrounding property. I don't have anything other than, personal knowledge to base that on. We haven't necessarily had any kind of detailed information on that, but just your property value is going to improve if you're not next to an empty, vacant, derelict lot. Now, the one question that I had, and I think it's been answered, goes to the unnecessary hardship. And that's why I was asking the questions regarding, whether or not this was just convenience or whether or not it was a requirement. And I think that was answered because when you look at the configuration of the lot and you look where the increase in dimensions is going to be, I think that it makes sense. It's definitely reasonable. The hardship would simply be that there would be no other place to put it without it having a negative impact on the development. So I see the hardship being a little bit different from what we had in 2306, but I still think it's been met. So there's my running on.
Excellent running on, I would say. I agree with all those remarks. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything further. I'll go back to my prior comment, but for the mistake, it'd be the same application, so I just leave it at that.
If I may, Mr. Chair, just for clarification.
Yes.
It's actually going to be ZBA 2307 was the one that specifically dealt with lot coverages. There was multiple variances and
Right,
special
okay.
exception grants. So just for the record, it's actually
2307.
2307, which was dealing with the lot coverage.
Sure, thank you for that. Mr. Gorman,
I'd like to make a motion.
I would love you to make one.
That would be to approve ZBA 2314.
I will second that. Now, we'll go through the criteria. Number one, granting the variance will not be contrary to the public interest. If you agree, raise your hand. That's unanimous. If the variance were granted, the spirit of the ordinance would be observed. Unanimous. Granting the variance would do substantial justice. Unanimous. If the variance were granted, the values of the surrounding properties would not be diminished. Unanimous. Owing to the special conditions of the property that distinguish it from others in the area, denial of the variance would result in an unnecessary hardship because no fair and substantial relationship exists between the general public purpose of the ordinance provision and its specific application to the property. That's unanimous. And on the main motion, all in favor? Unanimous. Thank you.
I hate to backtrack on you, but I should also add that under the fifth criteria that it's reasonable.
Will the record reflect that it was reasonable as part of that? Everybody agree? Okay, I'll take those nodding heads as a yes. Excellent. All right. Mr. Rogers, do we have any new business?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we actually do have a request for, to see if the board would be able to have a special meeting on this May 16th. We have an applicant or a person wishing to apply under Section 18.3.4. This is for a property that was a non-conforming in many ways. It was a two-family home on a substandard lot as far as square footage. Really didn't even have enough square footage to be a single-family home, but it had a two-family home on it. It's on a corner lot, so it also probably definitely had some nonconformities as far as setbacks. I'm not quite sure exactly how many. But under this section of the zoning ordinance, it does allow for when there's been a disaster of some sort outside of the control of the owner. It gives them the ability to rebuild as long as a building permit's been issued within 1 year. The May 24th of 22 was when the fire occurred at this structure. The structure has since been removed because it was beyond repair by the insurance company's determination. This section of the code does also give the ability, and I'll read it to you so the board's aware. It says that in the event that any non-conforming structure is damaged or destroyed without any contributing fault by the property owner or tenant, it may be repaired or rebuilt at to the same size and dimension as previously existed, provided that a building permit is obtained within 1 year following the damage or destruction, unless an additional 1-year extension is granted by the Zoning Board of Adjustment. There's a new buyer that's potentially interested in this lot. I'm not sure if the property owner was aware of that time limit or not. When they reached out to us, we made them aware, and they were not able to get onto this board's agenda in time, and as such, there's a request for a special meeting if the board is able to do so.
So what they want is an extension of that provision for another year to get they don't have a building permit yet, right?
Correct. That would be the application that would be in front of the board if they were so able to hold the special meeting on the 16th. And just so the board's aware, the zoning code is really silent on what criteria would need to be met for that, to grant into that extension. So it certainly would be just a board decision, but we do not, the zoning code does not spell out the criteria that would be needed to be reviewed in order to approve that extension.
So that's 2 weeks from tomorrow, basically, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Attorney Taylor?
Yeah, I had a question. Maybe it's late and I'm trying to listen at the same time. But does that mean that they build like in the same footprint, the same type
It would
of
have to be,
house?
they could not further violate setbacks, so it doesn't necessarily need to be right in that exact same footprint. If they wanted to move it away from move back a little bit from the corner, as long as it's less, they can make it more conforming if they want. They cannot make it any less conforming. So they would not be able to move it closer to the street, but they would be allowed to build based off of the fact that it was previously a non-conforming because of the use as a two-family. They would be able to rebuild a two-family. And technically, yes, they could put it back right in the same footprint, but they could move it back actually away to try and come in more compliance with the setbacks.
But the only issue for us would be whether or not to grant the 1-year extension to get the building permit.
Correct. We have taken the stance that we will be, if the board is so inclined to hold the special meeting, we are requiring the applicant to notice for that meeting any abutters as such, just so the board would be able to hear from abutters, just since it is such a non-compliant lot in many ways. We felt uncomfortable not noticing this extension. So we will be noticing abutters as we would with most other applications.
Now, the only question being just whether to extend the deadline for the building permit. Once the building permit is issued, it's your department that enforces what can go in there, right?
Correct.
We don't decide what can be built.
Correct. We would take a look at it. We would take a look at our records to, again, that we know there was a two-family there. The one that we'd have to do a little research on would be setbacks, but obviously if the applicant were to come in and say, we're gonna move it back and over, that would make it a very simple, application from our side as well, so.
If we don't have this emergency meeting, they'd have to come in for a variance for whatever they want to build there, basically, right? Because it's a
Correct.
non-conforming lot.
Once May 24th comes forward and the board hasn't heard or granted any extension, then at that point in time, a variance would be required to do anything on that lot. It is a corner lot, so there's some additional setback requirements that might be problematic. The fact that it was a two-family, even to build a single family on that lot would require a variance if the May 24th comes without an extension to the rebuild time period.
Guess my other last question is this from the time of the act of God, if you will, the fire, or is this from the time of the demolition of the remains?
This is actually the time from the fire, is the way the way I've interpreted the way that's been read, because again, it would, until they.
Otherwise, you could never demolish it and you'd just bide yourself a bunch of time. I mean, that determination makes sense to me. The only reason that I asked is if it was from the time of demolition, I would say the onus would be on the property owner that they hadn't done anything yet. But if it's from the time of the event, I could see how that could take a year.
The way it's worded here is, a building permit is obtained within 1 year following the damage or destruction.
Yep.
So,
And May 24th was that date?
Correct.
2022, okay.
correct.
Well, do we need to vote on having a special meeting? I mean,
I certainly would leave it up to the board. I think it would be, I don't know necessarily a vote, but a consensus that the May, I keep forgetting the date, May 16th is that the board's available, because we also need to make sure we have a room available, and so that's kind of limiting us on time-wise, because lots of meetings happen in the city. So that was the one date that kind of gave us enough time to get in and do the noticing properly.
Mike?
And have a room.
Well, just off the top of my head, I know I won't be here on the 16th, and I can't be. But I gather that the primary purpose of the meeting is to allow for this to be noticed and the public to have an opportunity to respond to the board's decision, which seems like an important thing. But I think this sounds like a pretty fast decision. And if there were no need for notice, I'd be willing to put in my 2 cents and say, go for another year right now.
I don't think we can do that.
Yeah, I think that tonight, trying to make that decision tonight, since it was not agendized, would certainly be problematic in many ways.
No,
And we've certainly made the applicant aware that also that, there could very well be that they would only be able to get a 3-member board. So they've made the desire to move forward any way that they can.
I will make myself available on the 16th. I'm not going anywhere, so as one member, it's not enough, but it's a start.
I don't have any cause to believe that I can't make it, but that's off the top of my head. I'd be willing to chime in by phone or Zoom or whatever if I had to, because again, this seems like not even a presentation. We're just trying to see if public shows up with any interest in the matter and.
Or compelling reason not to extend the deadline.
Right.
Well, it looks like I can make it, so, there.
I'm not available on Tuesdays.
So it looks like we should be able to offer a 3-member board, hopefully, and if, Mr. Gorman, if you could let us know before, and as soon as you can, I'll reach out to the applicant and get that process started then.
Yeah, I'll be able to let Corinne know definitively in the morning, but I also can commit to, if I am gonna be somewhere, it's gonna be on the road at a hockey rink, and I'll be able to do whatever I need to do.
We're not gonna be able to hear you, though.
Well, I'll do what I need to do, one way
Okay.
or another, if I can't be here physically.
Great.
Yeah, is the city allowing remote participation by members of the boards? I know they changed the rules.
I know at the council level they have, so we'd probably take the lead off that certainly.
I know they are no longer permitting public input that's remote, but I didn't know about participation.
I think we would probably take the lead from what the council's approved for their process and follow that same process for a member of the board to be able to participate, especially if it's a matter of us being able to get a quorum for this short notice time crunch. So, okay. We will set it up and let the board know, making sure that the applicant still wants to move forward with this.
When are you going to find out about space?
What our tenant, I believe, is here. I'll let Corinne speak to that, though.
We already have space available or reserved at Parks and Rec, second floor, room 22,
Down the street?
down the street.
Oh, that'll be good to be reminded of, because I'll show up here.
Yeah, where
What
is
the hell's going
everybody?
on?
Yeah. Oh, this space will be used, just not by us.
Oh, okay. I'll have to actually
Exactly.
drive somewhere. Well,
Boy, I might be a minute late if we have to, that's another minute, so
that'll screw you up, Josh. Oh, well. All right, do we have any miscellaneous matters? No?
That's
Okay.
all we had for the board tonight.
We never have a non-public, at least not tonight, and I guess we're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.